B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, August 13th, 2020. Some important news breaking from the Middle East today, as Israel has reached an agreement with the United Arab Emirates, and part of the deal is that Israel will forego its plans, for now, to annex occupied West Bank territory. Now, this is an important blink from Benjamin Netanyahu. He has been hell-bent to achieve this and enlisted the approval of Trump and Crown Prince Jared Kushner to move forward despite the objections of almost everyone, including some Israeli settlers occupying illegally portions of the West Bank. So Conman Don is doing his best to try to take credit for brokering this deal, and so far there's no real evidence that he had a significant role. But the statement released by the White House, called a joint declaration of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the U.S., quote, as a result of this diplomatic breakthrough and at the request of Trump with the support of the United Arab Emirates, Israel will suspend declaring sovereignty over areas outlined in the president's Vision for Peace, that was written by Crown Prince Jared, and focus its efforts now on expanding ties with other countries in the Arab and Muslim world. If it goes through, the agreement would make the UAE the third Arab country to establish normal diplomatic relations with Israel, after Egypt back in 1979 and Jordan, which signed a treaty in 1994. It could reorder the long stalemate in the region between Israel and its neighbors, potentially leading other Arab nations to follow suit. Now, there is risk to the Palestinians that they could be encircled by deals made between Israel and regional Arab and Muslim countries. But I think it dodges a dangerous bullet because the declaration of annexation could be permanent. Very hard for any kind of peace or other negotiations to unravel. And in the dry tone of the New York Times, the extent of the president's role in forging the deal was not immediately clear. Trump also has bragged in recent days that if he wins the election in November, he will have a deal with Iran within 30 days. Oh, really? Good luck with that one, Don. Prince Mohammed of the UAE put a different order on the agreement, which he said the first priority was to stop further Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories. And second or third, he said the UAE and Israel also agreed to cooperation and setting a roadmap toward establishing a bilateral relationship. The idea seems to go back to June when Youssef al-Otaiba, the Emirates ambassador to the United States, who's worked closely with the Trump group, wrote an op-ed in the Yediot Aharonot newspaper appealing directly to Israelis in Hebrew to deter Bibi from following through on his promise to annex the occupied territories. And in that column, al-Otaiba wrote, annexation will definitely and immediately reverse all of the Israeli aspirations for improved security, economic and cultural ties with the Arab world and the UAE. Regional neighbor Lebanon is the subject of an excellent piece at the Gray Zone today under the byline of Ben Norton, where he notes that American sanctions on Iran and Syria have helped cripple Lebanon economically, and following last week's mega blast at the port of Beirut, Washington has added new sanctions on political figures in the government of Lebanon. The Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that our government is preparing to impose new sanctions on Lebanese politicians and businessmen in an effort to weaken the influence of Hezbollah. And I think that is a serious misreading of a complicated political coalition that has run Lebanon into a serious economic and political crisis. But behind it all is that Lebanon doesn't have a functional military, and it is Hezbollah that repelled Israel from the occupation of southern Lebanon just a few years ago. And if you expel, this is my opinion, if you expel Hezbollah from the 18-party coalition that rules Lebanon, I think you will see a further collapse of what remains of any social order. Well, Trump can't help himself. As we have watched him appoint a mega donor to run the U.S. Postal Service, Louis DeJoy, the new Postmaster General, he is making cuts, slowing down delivery. And I'll just give you one example. I receive, modest dividend checks, and they were payable on the last day of July. And usually they show up on the 1st or 2nd of the following month. This time they showed up about 5 days later. So that's my own anecdotal information about the impact on the changes at the Postal Service. He's cut out overtime, and now it's reported that they are removing sorting machines from some post offices and postal annexes around the country. So in an interview with Maria Bartiromo, Trump blurted out that he opposes additional funding for the Postal Service in order to make it more difficult to deliver mail-in ballots. And it's no surprise that the negotiations for another relief package from Washington remain stalemated, and the Senate has formally adjourned until after Labor Day, so nothing's going to happen during this hot August break. And we've been led to believe that it's the Democrats' insistence on relief money for state and local governments amounting to just about $1 trillion of their their $3 trillion package that has been the real point of dispute. But Trump is now admitting that the plan to give $3.6 billion to states to run elections, including voting by mail, and $25 billion in support for the Postal Service, he's delighted that that money is not going to be allocated, if at all, or at least not anytime soon. He says if we don't make a deal, that means they don't get the money. That means they can't have universal mail-in voting. They just can't have it. Sort of a crazy thing, Trump said. And I'm reading that, so I don't know what his exact inflection was when he said that. But I can imagine it delights him to say that. And while I've been a little skeptical that his effort to use the post office to interfere in the election was not that serious, I have to concede I was probably wrong about that. The issue that still is top of mind is how does Trump think that delaying the mail processing at the Postal Service will only hurt Democrats? That, of course, is his goal. And his big objection to mail-in voting is that it eliminates or does an end run on the various voter suppression schemes that Republicans employ that are all focused on the polling place and preventing people who show up from actually getting to cast a ballot. Larry Kudlow, a former TV stock picker, said so much of the Democratic asks in the relief negotiations are really liberal left wish lists that we don't want to have. Voting rights, aid to aliens, and so forth. That's not our game. So Kudlow is pretty much affirming what Trump has said. So I find this fascinating because it's a really dumb move, a not very smart move on Trump's part, to reveal this. Up until the last couple of days, he had some sort of deniability. He's real good at denial. You can say, well, I just put a new guy in there. He's going to make the post office more efficient. After all, they run a deficit because of the actions of Congress, not because of their operations. Now, they have lost money during the pandemic. But before that, the red ink at the Postal Service is caused by the action, I believe it was in 2005, where Congress required the Postal Service to prepay retirement and health benefits for all of its employees. That is a huge tab every year. And it is the real reason for a deficit in the U.S. mail. So, dumb move, Trump. Another thing he said in the same interview is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is, quote, not even a smart person. He said that Biden, if president, is likely to fund the plans of Ocasio-Cortez, and seemingly out of nowhere, he said AOC was a poor student. This is not even a smart person. Went on to say that she says good lines of stuff and that she yaps. Well, the dumbass AOC had a very smart response, noting that Trump's niece, Mary Trump, in the recent book Too Much and Never Enough, divulged that her uncle paid somebody to take his SATs. And online, I've seen what is purported to be Trump's report card, his grades from his undergraduate work at Fordham University. And he was getting D's and C's, and I don't believe a single A or B showed up on that report card. So I think we know who wins that one. Trump is also compulsive because he does not have any patience. He wants Santa Claus to bring him the October surprise in August or at the latest September. And that, of course, is Bill Barr's investigation of the Russia investigators. And as you know, this one is tough for me because I don't believe the Russiagate narrative. I think that Barr will spring some very damaging information and evidence about the scheme that started at the FBI, was embraced by the intelligence community, backed by the Democrats, amplified by the media, and that lives on today like the virus that just won't go away. And so Trump is needling Bill Barr, not quite as badly as he did his predecessor, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III. But he's also going after the FBI director, Chris Wray, saying that they need to take more forceful roles in steering that investigation and, of course, bringing it public in time to do damage to the Democratic ticket. And my bottom line is that I don't trust Barr or his hand-picked investigator, John Durham, to do a nonpartisan investigation, even as I believe that there is serious misfeasance, at minimum, that occurred in that whole process. Over at the EPA, where Andrew Wheeler, the former coal lobbyist, is installed by Trump, and let me mention that yesterday there were 5 or 6 former EPA directors who signed a public statement demanding a reset of the agency that has been really dismantled and defanged by Trump and the previous guy, Scott Pruitt. You remember him? Well, the latest deregulation is to revoke rules that require oil and gas extractors to do their best to limit the escape of methane, one of the most potent greenhouse gases. The changes apply to new wells and those drilled since 2016. The regulations required companies to regularly check for methane leaks from valves, pipelines, and tanks, but no more. We're not worried. Now, with that in mind, I am recommending my latest in-depth interview released today at peterbcollins.com and all of our outlets, including iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher, featuring environmental journalist Steve Horn. And I haven't had a chance to talk to Steve for almost a year now. So we catch up on quite a few things. He's had a recent exchange with Professor Noam Chomsky that's fun to talk about. We discuss the reaction to Planet of the Humans, the Jeff Gibbs, Michael Moore film that was released on Earth Day this year. And we talk about the remarkable lifting of the fracking moratorium by California Governor Gavin Newsom and the new permit that allows Chevron and Goldman Sachs to build a this is so contradictory, a fracking field where all of the fracking that destroys the planet and extracts the ugliest crude oil available here in California and on the West Coast, that will all be powered by a solar array. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Steve Horn.
Underneath the LCFS, they have something called the Innovative Crude Oil applications, and this one was for solar-powered fracking. I guess it would have been fracking and oil drilling, and just solar powering in general of the Lost Hills oil field for Chevron's operation. So it's co-owned by, as you said, Chevron and Goldman Sachs. 240 acres, so a huge field of solar panels, but completely devoted to powering oil drilling and fracking for Chevron in this field. And so that is basically, they have this formula under the LCFS, and that's how they're going to green their, I guess, quote unquote, green their operations there, make it more climate friendly. And then they produce some of this solar, any excess solar is then sold to, under this application, to PG&E, or Pacific Gas and Electric, which is the big utility company in the area. And so that you look at the whole picture, that's, they're going to call that whole system of energy production, from the oil drilling to the solar power to selling it to the grid. That's how they get to the number. It's in a case study of how they get to the numbers that they get to within the low carbon fuel standard.
That's Enviro reporter Steve Horn. You can listen to the full interview released today at peterbcollins.com and our other outlets. You can find his reporting primarily at therealnews.com. And we also discuss other recent reports from Mr. Horn, including the resignation of a woman named Louise Bedsworth from a project called, she actually resigned from a California advisory board, but she's involved with Scopex, which is a high-tech effort to use geoengineering to reduce the heat coming from the sun. We also talk about Steve's recent reports about a wildfire in Arizona that burned over 300,000 acres and barely got any coverage in the mainstream media, and how it's prison inmates, who are the firefighters who provide the biggest labor force in Arizona and a major component here in California for fighting wildfires. And they get paid a pittance, and they also, through various regulations, these prisoners, once they're released, they have useful job skills as firefighters, but the laws prevent them from becoming firefighters once they leave incarceration. And another story on the Enviro front involves Richard Neal. He is the Massachusetts congressman who chairs the House Ways and Means Committee, a very powerful guy, and he responds to money. Now, he's not the only one in Washington, but he's a Democrat who deserves to be scrutinized. So Lee Fung at The Intercept reports that Richie Neal engineered a tax break for biofuel companies that is worth $3 billion a year. So what happened next? Well, it's not quite Hunter Biden and Burisma. But Richie Neal's little boy, Brendan, whose work experience includes lobbying for TransCanada, the company that owns the Keystone XL pipeline, Brendan Neal has been hired as a lobbyist for Trestle Energy, a California-based biofuel company specializing in low-carbon production systems. Well, at least he doesn't have to go to Ukraine to pick up his big checks. Oh, and Trump, ever the environmentalist, his big concern is that low-flow shower heads make it impossible for him to properly wash what's left of his hair. Now, at a time when people are starving, they're broke, they're facing foreclosure or eviction, they might have to sell their car to pay the rent or buy groceries. Trump is so out there. So he said he believes that water doesn't come out fast enough from fixtures, and he's previously complained about toilets, and I've never known him to be interested in plumbing. But now he said that these damn low-flow shower heads. He said, so what do? You just stand there longer, or you take a shower longer? Because my hair, I don't know about you, but it has to be perfect. Perfect. Narcissist. Tear gas returned to the streets of Portland last night, not dispensed by the federal goons, who we're told are still in town but staying off the streets, but by the Portland Police Department. And once again, I question the calling of a riot based on the conditions described by the local Portland newspaper, the Oregonian, because they described that there were some incidents where a large explosive and other fireworks were thrown toward officers, along with fist-sized rocks, bottles, and cans of paint. A single officer was injured in his hand, and others reported minor injuries. And this became the basis to declare that it was a riot situation, and that enables them to use a loophole in the newly enacted regulations in Portland and dispense tear gas. So I'm not there, and I could be wrong about this. There may be adequate justification. But last night, the protesters returned to downtown after shifting their focus to other areas of the city and police precincts, the police union headquarters. Around 11 p.m., the Portland police used a loudspeaker and said this criminal behavior must stop now. At about 11:20, they declared the gathering an unlawful assembly. Police hit the streets and, in some cases, chased away protesters. And just before midnight, police announced that they now considered the gathering to be a riot. They retreated soon after in a cloud of smoke released by the officers. And that is in contrast to Tuesday night, when the protests were entirely peaceful and there wasn't even minor property damage. So the U.S. Conference of Mayors, trying to be woke, trying to be responsive in this summer of rage, they announced a slate of recommendations for overhauling local police departments, including banning chokeholds, mandating that officers wear body cams, and limiting the power of police unions to keep problem officers on the job. Now, I support those measures, but their trade-off is an emphatic rejection of calls to defund the police. They say local government should increase funding for social workers and intervention counselors so that armed police officers are not necessarily the first to respond. Leading the advocacy is Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. We believe we have the right plan to implement real change. And she acknowledged that in the past, efforts to make change, similar recommendations have been relegated to the dustbin of history. She says we will not allow that to happen to this report. And given that it doesn't recommend cutting funding for the police, whether you call it defund or abolish or any of those verbs, I don't think it will have significant impact. Now, if they can get everybody to adopt those other elements, I don't oppose that. But it does not go far enough, and the public will figure that out. In Louisville, members of Breonna Taylor's family and their lawyer met with the Kentucky Attorney General and the mayor of Louisville this week to discuss the progress, and it has been 150 days since Breonna Taylor was killed by cops in her bed. And they're still waiting, the family is, for officers to be terminated and for charges to be filed. Justice delayed is justice denied. So, across multiple media outlets today, I have noticed a similarity in the language that is being used to talk about the way Trump and his allies have been attacking Senator Kamala Harris since she was named as the running mate for Joe Biden. And the line is the same everywhere. This is the front page of my San Francisco Chronicle, local political writer Joe Garofoli. The subhead reads, "Republicans can't draw a bead on her for coherent line of political attack." Then an AP story published in my uber-local Marin Independent Journal headlined, "Trump looks for line of attack on the Democratic ticket." The New York Times, "Trump searches for a line of attack as Biden and Harris hammer his handling of the virus." Now, the implication here that they create is that Trump is just fumbling around and, Kamala Harris is such a complex figure. She's hard to, figure out what her swift boat vulnerability happens to be. But I think that gives Trump way too much credit. He operates more like a shotgun, just firing those pellets wherever they go to see which one might draw blood. And it has led to very inconsistent arguments coming from the campaign that, she's too progressive, but not progressive enough for progressives, that she's a radical leftist, when any radical leftist will tell you that's bullshit. And so Trump just makes it up as he goes along. And in that same Fox Business interview with Maria Bartiromo, he was just flailing around in his attacks on Kamala Harris. Now, you have a sort of mad woman, I call her, because she was so angry and such hatred with Justice Kavanaugh. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. She was the angriest of the group, and they were all angry. They're all radical left angry people. Now, some of this word soup or word salad surfaces from what Trump collects in his brain, and it's a really good one, from the pollster comments, the focus groups. And so he's just regurgitating stuff that he has heard are defects or negatives of his opponent. Meanwhile, I want to recommend a column by Joe Laria at Consortium News, where he examines the record of Kamala Harris related to WikiLeaks. And while in one exchange in a Senate, I don't know if it was quite a debate, but in a committee meeting, she did raise objections to inserting language in a bill that would describe WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence service. Now, that line was first delivered by Mike Pompeo when he was running the CIA. And only two senators objected to it. It was Ron Wyden of Oregon and Kamala Harris of California. But she went on to say this. She declared that she is no supporter of WikiLeaks, which has done considerable harm to the United States. But the clause on the group dangerous because it fails to, I see, the clause about the group is dangerous because it fails to draw a bright line between WikiLeaks and legitimate news organizations that play a vital role in our democracy. And she wants that bright line because she is saying that it's okay for the New York Times to publish materials from WikiLeaks, but that WikiLeaks itself is not journalism. It doesn't enjoy the same independence and freedom. And Laria notes, because there is no legal distinction, the Obama administration backed away from indicting WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, citing the New York Times problem. The Trump administration had no such qualms and had Assange arrested in April 2019, indicted on conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, 17 counts under the Espionage Act. And Laria says the only bright line that can be drawn is political. A decision by the Department of Justice to not prosecute big media but to prosecute WikiLeaks for the same alleged crime conflicts with First Amendment press freedoms. This is what Harris was calling for. Protect the state-managed corporate media, but go after a serious publication that declares to reveal crimes that dares to reveal crimes of the U.S. government. I think that's good analysis from my friend Joe Laria. I also recommend an op-ed published today at The Guardian under the byline of Derica Purnell. Headlined, Why Black Progressive Women Feel Torn About Kamala Harris. She says Harris is sharp, strategic, witty, undoubtedly qualified to be Veep. She graduated from a historically black college, belongs to a prestigious black sorority, a biracial woman with Jamaican and Indian heritage. We've seen her break color barriers and shatter glass ceilings. Even though poor black women have felt and swept up the falling shards. Later she writes, then there's the fatigue. Progressives will have to defend the California senator's personal identity while maneuvering against her political identity. Political accession and racism go together like stars and stripes. Michelle Obama was horribly depicted as an ape. Donald Trump called Maxine Waters a low IQ individual. And just weeks ago, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was called disgusting and a fucking bitch by a fellow member of Congress. Yet the defense against racist, sexist attacks must not interfere with the necessary offense required to push the Biden-Harris political ticket for people who choose to play the electoral politics game. When activists criticized Obama, we were scathingly reminded how hard it was for him to be a black man in the White House. We were told to wait. And Derica Purnell doesn't want to wait. So I think it's an interesting column. Check it out if you're so inclined. Uber and Lyft are having a high-tech temper tantrum because a California judge ruled that they're in violation of AB 5, which defines their drivers as employees and not independent contractors, entitles them to overtime, minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment, health benefits. Uber and Lyft, which of course say they're competitors, they have aligned in a threat to suspend service in California. They're going to punish the entire state and all of their drivers, call them employees, because in a misplaced effort at extortion, following in the tracks of Elon Musk, they believe that they're powerful enough to really bludgeon California voters into approving a ballot measure that we'll see in November that would overrule AB 5 and allow these disruptive companies to declare that they define their employees as contractors, and damn it, if you don't like that, we're going to shut down our service. Now, Lyft reported losses of ride bookings and revenue fell 73% to $3 billion in the first quarter. That's Uber's number. Lyft said Wednesday it lost $437 million on revenues of $339 million from April to June. So they're bleeding badly. I don't think they can afford to shut down. But, of course, they're propped up by venture capital that sees this as a way to destroy the licensed taxi industry. And ultimately, these drivers are going to be jettisoned when self-driving cars provide the paid rides that Uber and Lyft are offering today. Of course, they don't say that. They talk about how important their drivers are, how much they want flexibility. They don't want to be bound by these rules. But the truth is, these are people who are desperate for an income, willing to depreciate their own cars, pay for their own gas and oil and repairs, in a job that, on average, pays them below the minimum wage, $8 or $9 an hour here in California. A couple more tech stories. U.S. Facebook users who post about voting may start seeing an addendum to their messages, labels directing readers to authoritative information about the upcoming presidential election. Now, this sounds harmless enough on the face of it. But who gets to decide what post requires correction, additional information, including corrective information? And when you know that there is a group of fact-checkers who have been hired by Facebook, but who now are grumbling that they are ignored when they recommend that a certain post be taken down. One example, Prager University. This is the brainchild of Dennis Prager. He's a right-wing talk radio host from San Diego. And I don't believe there is a real Prager University. I think it's more like Trump University. Anyway, they published a video on Facebook that incorrectly claimed there is no evidence that CO2 emissions are the dominant factor in climate change. Climate Feedback, a nonpartisan network of scientists, a member of Facebook's global fact-checking partnership, rated that content as false, but it wasn't taken down. And despite the fact that this was a second strike and Facebook has a repeat offender policy, a Facebook employee intervened on behalf of PragerU and asked for a re-examination, citing partner sensitivity and the amount of money that PragerU had spent on Facebook ads. That post remains, and neither the public, the fact-checkers, or Facebook's own employees was informed of that decision. And on the way to get the information about the protests in Portland last night at the website of the Oregonian, I found this story about the teeny-weeny town on the Oregon coast called Tierra del Mar. It's right on the beach there. And Facebook bought a vacant lot. Despite that it's entirely a residential community, they started work drilling to bring a fiber optic cable ashore from the Pacific Ocean. And today, about 1,100 feet of pipe, a drill tip, various other tools, and 6,500 gallons of drilling fluid sit under the seafloor just off the Oregon coast. They started construction earlier this year. Then they hit an unexpected area of hard rock. That's when the drill bit became lodged. The pipe snapped 50 feet below the seafloor. But they were unable to recover some of the equipment. They delayed reporting it. And now, well, they're subject to penalties from the Oregon authorities. They're saying that there's no way they can retrieve their junk from the bottom of the sea. You may have heard that Jared Kushner was in Colorado last weekend and managed to set up a meeting with Kanye West. You may also have heard that Kanye, who's had this on-and-off idea of running for president this fall, has been getting help from Republican attorneys in order to qualify him to be on the ballot in various states. And there's a report from Wisconsin that a lawyer affiliated with the Trump campaign showed up at the office 15 seconds after the 5 o'clock closing time and her filing was rejected on behalf of Kanye. But legal experts say that a meeting between Kushner and Kanye could be illegal, depending on exactly what they discussed and if there was any coordination, because Jared has a top role running the Trump campaign, and it's very clear that Kanye is some sort of a proxy, a stalking horse, I don't know what you call him, because I don't understand any logic of what voters he would pull away from the Democratic Party. I just don't get that. So we'll see. We know that the Federal Elections Commission doesn't have enough members to have any impact in this current situation. Here's our daily COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide on our big scoreboard, the Jumbotron, we're now showing 20.6 million cases, 749,000 deaths. In the United States, a reported 5.22 million cases, and the increase was about 55,000 over the past 24 hours. And it's been pretty steady in the 50 to 55,000 range. But yesterday, the death toll ticked back up to just under 1,500 after a couple of days where the data reports indicated only 500 deaths nationwide here in the U.S. of A. More than half of the deaths reported yesterday were spread across 5 states that saw some of the most dramatic case spikes in June and July. Texas reported more than 300 deaths on Wednesday, Florida more than 200, Arizona, California, Georgia all reported more than 100 each. And while Governor Newsom here is claiming they've got their data glitches worked out, and he said cautiously that we may be turning a corner, well, that we still do not know. It will take time to put that into perspective. We're also seeing data that shows that testing is dropping, not increasing. Across the United States, it was down by about 4.5% over the past week. New cases slowed over the past week in 21 states, including Arizona, Florida, Texas, and the southern states that saw the surges in June and July. And we're going to have to see this downward trend continue for quite a while before we can claim that the outbreaks have been contained. New data showing a startling surge in children and teenagers diagnosed with COVID-19, according to a report from NBC today. And they quote Dr. Jody Dion Odom, who is at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. The pediatric cases are in all of the same states that we know are surging with adults who have the disease. But the U.S. is logging the highest number of deaths in the past month. The 1,400-plus reported Wednesday were the highest since July 28th, when the number was 2,218. Tighter limits on testing may help reduce the long turnaround times, often edging up to 2 weeks now, that made the testing significantly less useful. But it could mean that some infected people will slip through the cracks, potentially infecting others before they begin to feel sick. Widespread testing shortages raise concerns that the figures coming out of the hardest-hit states might not be presenting a true picture of the pandemic. And Dr. Ashish Jha, Harvard Health Institute, quote, "I really have come to believe that we have entered a real, new, emerging crisis with testing, and it is making it hard to know where the pandemic is slowing down and where it's not." In Texas, stricter measures taken in June and July appeared tied to a decline in hospitalizations and ICU patients. But, as we are saying, that combined with a huge decline in testing. The number of tests being carried out this week in Texas fell below 18,000, far below the peak in July. That's a daily number, by the way, when daily tests exceeded 89,000. So they're being driven by Trump's erroneous claim that if you don't test, you won't find cases, and then they don't exist, and then you can just forget about it, right? And the positivity rate in Texas right now is 24% of those tested. That is a very significant number. Coronavirus has been found on frozen food packaging in 3 Chinese cities. In Shenzhen, authorities conducting routine screenings detected the virus on a sample of frozen chicken wings that were imported from Brazil. Trump's latest COVID advisor is Dr. Scott Atlas. He's a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, which is a parking place for the most conservative minds on the West Coast. He is not an infectious disease expert. He is a board-certified radiologist. But he has appeared on Fox recently, drawn the attention of Trump, and he's called on schools to open their doors for in-person instruction, railed against the frenzy around mass testing. And as it relates to schools, Trump is still relentless, pushing for schools to reopen. Pretty much damned the consequences. He reiterated today, we got to open up. We got to open up our schools and open up our businesses. Children often have only mild symptoms, and medical complications are incredibly rare, very, very, very rare, he said. Those that do face complications often have underlying medical conditions. Well, that doesn't mean that they won't get sick and that they won't die. Now, while fewer children are sickened to the extent of adults, they are hospitalized at a lower rate, but once they are hospitalized, they end up in intensive care at similar rates to adults. And we have to acknowledge that they could be asymptomatic carriers of the virus, infecting their parents, teachers, and other people they encounter. And the cautionary tale is the Paulding County School District in Georgia. The viral photo that we saw last week of all those backpack-laden students jammed together in a hallway. I only saw one mask in the picture. There are now 35 positive cases since the first day of school, and they've had to make some changes to their plans. They have a new hybrid model of in-person instruction and virtual learning, which will bring students onto campus in shifts. Well, we'll see what kind of impact that has. And get this, over at the quite conservative American Enterprise Institute, the think tank's director of education policy, Rick Hess, he said that he's very concerned about reopening schools at this point. If you had told me that Trump was doing this as a favor to the schools must not open crowd, I'd believe you. As the president has pushed for schools to reopen, parents have largely moved in the other direction. A recent Washington Post poll found that parents disapprove of Trump's handling of school reopening by a 2/3 majority. And a new Gallup poll shows that fewer parents want their children to return to school buildings now than felt that way this past spring. The super rich are finding a way to divert themselves during the coronavirus lockdowns that many Americans face. I had my partner and I had a trip planned to go to Italy at the end of August, but Italy will not let us into the country, and I don't feel like getting on an airplane for 8 or 10 hours these days. But a billionaire in Los Angeles has been hosting lavish dinner parties where an on-site nurse administers a 15-minute coronavirus test as guests sip cocktails and then allow them in once their test comes back negative. And some of the super rich are paying as much as $2 to $3 million to buy international citizenships, then zipping to a country where they're permitted to claim citizenship on their private jets. Isn't life grand? We're also seeing rich people set up backyard schools or using their money to hire teachers for small groups of children. And while you can understand that every parent wants the best for his or her child, this will only exaggerate the gap between rich and poor in this country and further erode support for our public schools. Last night on the PBS NewsHour, Kellyanne Conway made an appearance, and she dared Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to do something about the pandemic. This was her response to Harris's broadsides at the introductory photo op that happened in Delaware yesterday. And so Biden and Harris apparently got that message, and they said, well, okay. And after they held a briefing with a panel of health experts today, Joe Biden emerged and said every single American should be wearing a mask when they're outside for the next 3 months at a minimum. Every governor should mandate mandatory mask wearing. And Joe said, be a patriot, protect your fellow citizens, step up, do the right thing. And that lawsuit that Georgia Governor Brian Kemp launched against the mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, because she proclaimed a mask rule in Atlanta, and he wanted to erode that, to commandeer it. So he has announced that he is dropping the lawsuit he filed to try to impose his override of her local decision. Linda also shared with me that 2 billionaire-funded think tanks want to use the pandemic to justify permanent deregulation of corporations and shrinking of government. Over at the Heritage Foundation, quote, the pandemic has underscored the economic and opportunity costs of overregulation and the folly of looking to Washington rather than to our robust civil society for solutions to our most pressing problems. And the Mercatus Center at George Mason University proposes that all regulations be suspended, that have been suspended or modified during the pandemic should remain in suspension. Now, this is just insulting, because many of the regulations that have been rolled back have nothing to do with the pandemic. It's opportunism. And this isn't an exact example, but it represents the mindset of what's going on. In a report from Mint Press News today on Raul Diego, he notes that there has been an effort called the Anti-Money Laundering Act that was tucked inside the Defense Authorization Act, mandates the creation of a beneficial ownership record, which would force the public disclosure of any U.S.-based company's ownership. And what's been going on is that people set up shell companies, they incorporate in Bermuda or the Bahamas, and they set up a web of entities so you can't figure out who actually owns them. But, of course, this is being watered down, and there is an effort by several senators to delete that amendment to the Pentagon budget bill. And get this, even if the owners are forced to disclose their beneficial ownership of a corporation or an entity, they want to keep it all secret. There will be a database created by the Treasury Department that will only be accessible to law enforcement agencies. That's transparency in the COVID era. And finally today, the scene in Belarus continues to be very tense. And despite the brutal efforts of soldiers and police officers to suppress the protests, thousands of workers at state enterprises across Belarus today staged walkouts. Women dressed in white carried flowers. They formed human chains in the capital, Minsk, to protest the brutal crackdown on demonstrators. The public displays of defiance are unlike anything the country has seen since it separated from the Soviet Union in 1991. And the strongman Alexander Lukashenko, who claimed an 80% victory in Sunday's election, remains firmly with a grip on the scene. But even Mike Pompeo, he told those friendly propagandists at Radio Free Europe that the United States wants good outcomes for the Belarusian people. And he said the U.S. has observed the violence, the aftermath, peaceful protesters being treated in ways that are inconsistent with how they should be treated. Is the irony evident to you? Mike Pompeo appears to care more about the protest rights of people in Belarus than he does in Portland or Seattle or anywhere else in the U.S. of A. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it with absolutely everyone. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.